Mental hospitals once dominated the landscape. The campuses spanned several dozen acres at times, keeping patients away from respectable society. When President Ronald Reagan took office, much of the Mental Health Act of 1980 was repealed, and so did federal funding for psychiatric facilities. Insane asylums all but disappeared, and their patients emptied out onto the street. While it's no wonder why these institutions shut down, barbaric treatments, lockdown status, it's not as simple as that. These buildings were initially created for curative purposes, but soon turned into prisons. These became highly expensive holding tanks, where the mentally ill were often housed with the criminally insane, or people who honestly just should not have been there from the beginning. As we modernized as a society, and as new categories of crime and health were criminalized, insane asylums became quite outdated. The services became underserving, initially designed for about 100 patients, now trying to serve thousands. So where exactly did all these patients go? Why don't we use insane asylums anymore? When did this shift in mental health treatment actually happen? We'll answer all these questions and more in today's video. Let's look at 3 main causes of asylum shutdown through medical, political, and social factors. Hi, I'm Madeline Feierstein, trained historian and criminologist. I study crime, prisons, and America during wartime. I also focus on the psychiatric hospitals constructed by Thomas Story Kirkbride. You know Thomas Story Kirkbride, the pioneering physician who designed these creepy Gothic buildings that promoted healing and community and safety. The Kirkbride plan focused on building these insanely large central buildings. No pun intended. I have a whole video on Kirkbride's plan, which I'm going to link below. Later generations added outbuildings, which became known as the cottage plan. The cottage plan simulated a home environment, moving away from the dormitory-style central buildings to these smaller ones that people could learn to re-enter society a little better. But the clunkiness of these asylums were not enough to shut them down. That's the tricky bit, isn't it? They were designed to heal people and to help civilians. They were created to reintegrate afflicted persons back into society, but they became prisons, often confining patients for weeks, months, even decades at a time. And with that, let's begin our countdown. Number 1, inhumane conditions. It took longer than you would think to shut down a facility just because it essentially tortured people. Insane asylums did not start out this way. We must keep in mind the limited knowledge of the brain and how it works in this time period. If you didn't have access to our modern terminology, neuroscience, and medicine, you would also think that the guy talking to himself is possibly possessed by demons, or that the person suffering from very severe mood swings was under some type of supernatural curse or influence. But more importantly, in industrializing America, many physicians just did not believe people could be cured, that they could be fixed, that they could get better. Thus, many patients in the asylum era were only treated for their symptoms and not the root cause of what was actually afflicting them. The cottage plan tried to mitigate these problems associated with the large central buildings. The large central buildings were very difficult to heat, expensive to maintain, and suffered from overcrowding. Additionally, we're entering the progressive era, roughly around 1890 to the 1930s, marked by great social change and civilians becoming very active in government policy and wanting to actually influence government actions. Americans started to look into the darker corners of society, especially during a time when child labor laws were being assessed, women took to the streets for equal rights, and early civil rights movements were taking off. This didn't mean that the switch suddenly flipped to positive overnight. Mental health patients were still considered some of the lowest groups on the societal totem pole. However, during this time of progressive change, some more inhumane treatments like hydrotherapy were phased out in favor of newer, safer treatments. Number 2, psychiatric drugs and treatment shifts. These newer treatments made it easier to actually care for patients and then release them back into society sooner, reducing the number of admissions in general and especially long-term patient care. So hydrotherapy was out. We're no longer treating people in ice baths or dousing them in an immense amount of water, but a new, initially chaotic form of treatment was in: electroshock. It's still in use today to treat symptoms of depression and seizures, but it is markedly safer and less stigmatized than before. Because it was considered an easier and quicker method to sedate patients, it allowed doctors to treat more people at once, and thus continuing the funneling out of people in and out of the asylums, allowing for a greater circulation of admissions. The straitjacket as well became a bit obsolete in the mid-century. Doctors found a newer and relatively safer way to treat aggravated patients: psychiatric drugs. The popular mood stabilizer lithium hit the market in 1948, followed by the antipsychotic Thorazine in 1952. Unfortunately, lobotomies became a trend. These quick procedures into the frontal lobe of the brain through the eye allowed patients to return home to their families sooner than later, but it significantly impacted their personality and oftentimes their ability to function independently. Eugenics, the popular social cause of the progressive era, was shockingly on the decline in the mid-century. Because of its association with Nazism and the Holocaust, doctors started to move away from phrenology, study of the skull size, and other pseudoscientific methods such as classifying race. And many groups who were confined in the asylum because of eugenics, such as their ethnic characteristics or very livable disabilities, they were now not being admitted for these reasons, so admissions had declined. And lastly, number 3, deinstitutionalization and community care. So we've established that insane asylums were a ticking time bomb, right? Outgoing President Jimmy Carter signed the Mental Health Act of 1980 into law. This allowed for more federal funding for state and local psychiatric centers and increased patient rights. All good things. However, an aspect of this act was deinstitutionalization, moving away from inpatient care in favor of outpatient. Inpatient, outpatient, community care? What's even the difference? Inpatient requires commitment or admission to a facility. In the days of the insane asylum, this was almost always several months, 2 years, to a lifetime. In today's world, you can still be admitted inpatient to a psychiatric facility. This is often a few days up to a week. Outpatient means you're receiving services and treatment, but you're not staying there overnight. This is very common. If you go to a facility for individual therapy, group therapy, or support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. Community care is a very broad term that means long-term services provided by public and private organizations. We see this today in group homes, rehab centers, residential treatment centers for teenagers, and daytime care for the elderly or disabled adults. Newly inaugurated President Ronald Reagan repealed much of the Mental Health Act of 1980 due to Reaganomics and wanting a smaller federal budget. So much of that funding for these better treatments and better care options went down the drain. It also limited the federal government's ability to monitor, maintain, and conduct oversight over these insane asylums, which by the 1980s, they weren't calling them insane asylums, right? They're just called psychiatric centers. With the rise of community care and the lack of funding, state-run asylums and local institutions began to shut down. They could not physically or financially support these buildings anymore and the patients inside them. Many of these buildings were well over 100 years old by the 1980s. When asylums shut their doors, they tried to transfer their patients to other facilities as much as possible. Sadly, not everybody could receive a spot, and this is where we see the modern homelessness crisis originate. Homelessness has its roots in deinstitutionalization, when many mentally ill persons were left on the street, unable to support themselves or advocate for their care. For many of them, psychiatric centers and asylums were their only home, the only place they could receive help, and now they're all by themselves on the street. What are the other causes of asylum shutdown? There are many more than I'm listing today. To learn more about Thomas Story Kirkbride, the history of insane asylums, and psychiatry in America, check out my playlist called Insane Asylums in the description. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye!